So what about the discipline of detachment? A well-known yet greatly misunderstood and mischaracterized philosophical concept, generally defined as a state in which a person overcomes his or her attachment to desire for things, people, or concepts of the world, and thus attains a heightened perspective. So right away comes the common charge that detachment means that one is cold, apathetic, or uncaring. This association is mainly due to confusing the meaning of the concept as used in psychology with the meaning of the concept as used in philosophy. For the purposes of this video, we will be primarily concerned with the philosophical implications of detachment, but we'll do a general overview of the psychological meanings anyway, so as to get a better understanding of the subject by exploring many of its various facets. In psychology, detachment is recognized as an emotional divestment with a possible twofold functionality, one positive, one negative. The negative aspect definitely being a detriment for obvious reasons. And it is the side of emotional detachment in psychology that is supposedly lacking empathy, which usually gets associated with detachment in general, which thereby taints the entire concept with an adverse connotation. So, in psychological terms, positive emotional detachment can be a behavior which allows a person to react calmly to highly emotional circumstances or individuals. Emotional detachment in this sense is a decision to avoid engaging emotional connections rather than an inability or difficulty in doing so, typically for personal, social, or other reasons. In this sense, it can allow people to maintain boundaries, psychic integrity, and avoid undesired impact by or upon others related to emotional demands. As such, it is a deliberate mental attitude which avoids engaging the emotions of others. This detachment does not necessarily mean avoiding empathy. Rather, it allows the person space needed to rationally choose whether or not to be overwhelmed or manipulated by such feelings. Examples where this is used in a positive sense might include emotional boundary management, where a person avoids emotional levels of engagement related to people who are in some way emotionally over-demanding, such as difficult coworkers or relatives. This form of emotional detachment is basically harmless and is mostly related to being in a position of responsibility, possibly as a work requirement or parental role, where being calm while dealing with highly charged emotional people is part of the job description. It wouldn't be beneficial for a doctor to get wrapped up emotionally while treating his patients, for example, as it would interfere with his ability to perform his duties. Then there is negative emotional detachment to a lesser degree, being considered emotional numbing, emotional blunting, i.e. disassociation, depersonalization, or in its chronic form, depersonalization disorder. This type of emotional numbing or blunting is a disconnection from emotion and is frequently used as a coping or survival skill during traumatic childhood events, such as abuse or severe neglect. Over time and with much use, this can become second nature when dealing with day-to-day stressors. Emotional detachment often arises from psychological trauma. It is a component in many anxiety and stress disorders. The person, while physically present, moves elsewhere in the mind, and in a sense is not entirely present, making them sometimes appear preoccupied. Thus, such detachment is often not as outwardly obvious as other psychiatric symptoms. People with this problem often have emotional systems that are in overdrive. They may have a hard time being a loving family member. They may avoid activities, places, and people associated with any traumatic events they have experienced. The disassociation can also lead to lack of attention and hence to memory problems, and in extreme cases, amnesia. Social ostracism, such as shunning or parental alienation, are other examples where decisions to shut out a person creates a psychological trauma for the shunned party. Then there is negative emotional detachment to a higher degree, wherein the person may seem fully present but operate merely intellectually when emotional connection would be appropriate. This may present an extreme difficulty in giving or receiving empathy, and can be related to the spectrum of narcissistic personality disorder. The kind of heavy negative emotional detachment also allows for acts of extreme cruelty, such as torture and abuse, supported by the decision to not connect empathetically with the person concerned. So boom, there it is right there. This is the form of negative emotional detachment more generally known about and associated to detachment in general, the definition of which ends up being the accusation most commonly leveled at philosophical detachment. Obviously, this conflation is a misrepresentation, the motive of which is most likely to dissuade an individual from freeing themselves from attachments by maligning the tool of freedom from this snare as something insidious and unsavory. In other words, whether people are even consciously aware of it or not, the natural inclination of individuals in delusion is to try to keep everyone else also in delusion. It's mostly due to the conditioning, but sometimes there are also rare cases where the misdirection is deliberate and malicious. So no, detachment in the philosophical context has nothing to do with the management of emotions for practical applications, nor of the emotional disorders of broken psychologies, but has everything to do with severe clinging attachments that inevitably bring deep suffering. Attachments, in this case, clarified specifically to mean letting the configurations of illusory external appearances be conditional to some imagined state of emotional equilibrium. A pursuit that cannot ever be realized from its approach, as real lasting inner peace is unconditional and is unrelated to the addict-like fixation of wanting certain gratifying feelings to be experienced while wanting other frustrating feelings to be avoided. So any assertion of detachment represented to mean not caring or being devoid of empathy is an issue of psychology, not of philosophy. And this distinction should always be clarified for the purposes of serious discourse. Yet even if this distinction becomes clarified, one should also be prepared to recognize another major form of discouragement used to disregard detachment. And that is that the pursuit of this discipline is a waste of time because its objective is an ideal. This type of dissuasion is a very commonly used tactic of the awareness-denying externalists. Indeed, it seems to be one of their favorites, as it is generously used as a sort of quick-fix, one-dismissal-fits-all repudiation. When in doubt, dismiss it as an ideal. And of course, I say, whenever they play the ideal card on you, it means you are on the right track. Forge ahead with extra vigilance. So now that we have elucidated these specific points about the general topic of detachment, let's tackle a couple of other common misunderstandings, which is that detachment is basically the same thing as, or achieves the same purpose as, avoidance, denial, or abstinence. This couldn't be further from the truth pertaining to the aim and intent of detachment. Concerning avoidance, people often think that if they can identify the things that disturb their inner peace and then set about to avoid them, that this somehow equates into some kind of form of detachment. Or that if one has no control over some feeling or experience they encounter, that ignoring it is a form of detachment. Sorry, but this doesn't cut the mustard. The first thing you need to come to terms with is that it isn't anything out here that is actually disturbing your inner peace. So seeking to avoid any such factor isn't going to achieve the necessary subjugation and hence mastery over the mind. Same goes for ignoring. Yes, the word is ignore, which, on a side note, should be parsed for its crypto-semantic implications, as the word ignore and the word ignorance have a specific relational significance worth meta-analyzing. But not to digress, ignoring isn't detachment. Ignoring is indicative of resentment, despite pretending that it doesn't bother you. It's obvious that whatever it is that you are pretending doesn't bother you is indeed bothering you if you feel the need to go out of your way to ignore it. It's still succeeding in bothering you, but ignoring it is just the suspension of making the proper inner adjustments. These types of provocations that are seeking to push your buttons are graciously serving as an instructive teaching, showing us exactly what we need to tweak within ourselves to overcome the power we give away by letting a state of inner peace be conditional to arrangements of illusion. I know you get upset when your buttons are pushed, but the hope is that perhaps after you eventually get bored and tired of always acting like a predictable wind-up toy, that you will finally arrive at the point where you become aware of the existence of these buttons and consciously choose to remove them. You don't have to feel you are compromising anything by doing this, for little by little you are making yourself impervious to oppression and manipulation. And don't expect any pats on the back for showing tolerance, as this still reflects an aversion. You'll get credit only when whatever it is you think you are so graciously tolerating truly doesn't have the ability to bother you anymore. If you are avoiding or ignoring arrangements of appearances in an attempt to try to sustain a state of inner contentment, you are still playing the game of investments. And this isn't the discipline of detachment. What the world needs is acceptance, not tolerance. None of us should tolerate within ourselves a sentiment of harnessed hatred or binded resentment. But that doesn't mean act it out either. It means purging all hate from the heart and becoming centered in all-encompassing acceptance.